Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm Bronwen Maddox. I'm Director of the Institute. Delighted to have you here for this conversation with Adrian O'Neill, the Irish Ambassador. Started a few months ago in the post at what could not be a more lively time. Apologies for starting a few minutes late. We will run on by that time, so we've got the full hour. As I said,
sorry? I forgot to do the essential thing, turn off the phone, sorry.
Yes, that's right, we're being heckled by ourselves up here. I know there are going to be a lot of questions, but we're going to plunge into conversation, and then you can pick up the points that you feel we may have missed. Adrian, thank you very much indeed for coming.
Nice to see you again after 20 years.
We met in Washington at what seem more peaceful times in the Clinton administration before everything, it feels like. Let's start with where we are now, in fact, where we are since yesterday. What happened from your point of view?
Well, I think what happened was, I mean, I'm not a member of the core negotiating team, so I can't kind of give you a detailed chronology in terms of everything that happened. But I mean, I think as the Taoiseach outlined, I think yesterday, particularly over recent days, there have been an intensification in the discussions and the negotiations involving the UK government, the Commission Task Force on Ireland. There was a text specifically on the Northern Ireland issues, which was being shared and discussed between the three sides. A good deal of progress had been made on that text. There still, I think, remained a couple of outstanding issues on Sunday. But a cabinet meeting was called in Dublin on Monday morning to look at the text with a view to getting the approval of the Irish government. That was secured, and I think, as the Taoiseach indicated then after that meeting yesterday, he got a call from President Juncker and President Tusk to confirm that UK agreement, and that basically it was full steam ahead.
And you understood by this that the DUP was on side at that point, or presumed?
Well, I mean, this was a negotiation. I mean, it's involving two governments and the Commission Task Force. From the Irish government's point of view, we were dealing with the UK government and with the Commission. I don't know to what extent the DUP was been kept briefed on in relation to developments. I mean, that's obviously a matter for the UK government rather than the Irish government.
Yeah, all right. What, from the Irish government's point of view, is the absolute essential as far as that border is concerned? Well,
as you probably know, Bronwen, I mean, at the moment we have an open and invisible border on the island of Ireland. That's a consequence of two things. Number one, the achievement of the single market, about 1992, where the customs posts disappeared, and then subsequently, as a result of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, the security installations that had been there, the border posts and so on, they also were dismantled. So, I mean, currently, if you can get into your car in Dublin and within 2 hours you're in Belfast and you won't even know when you're crossing the border. The only thing that will probably indicate that you have crossed the border is that the signs change from kilometres to miles. Other than that, it's an open and invisible border, and that has been a huge enabler of the progress that we've made over the last 20 years in terms of bringing communities together, which had previously been literally fractured by the existence of a border, who had kind of lived back to back each other for the first time, were actually turning towards each other, so that you began, for example, to get the development of a kind of a mini regional economy between, for example, Dundalk and Newry. For instance, it was a huge facilitator of normalisation of relations on the island. So for us, basically, what this is about, it's about maintaining the status quo. It's about making sure that we avoid any hardening of the border in Ireland, and that has been the objective of the Irish government going back, since the Brexit referendum, and we've been very, very consistent in pursuing that objective. And so it's about maintaining an open border, because an open border is essential to the protection of the peace process and the Good Friday Agreement.
And in your government's view, the form of words that was being used in Brussels, even though people say, look, it was shrouded with ambiguity, that was enough to keep the border open, in your view?
Well, again, I mean, look, the text of this document has not been released, so I don't want to get drawn into too much detail in relation to what was in it or how it was being expressed or all of that. The key point for us is that what was in it represented a very clear and firm commitment to maintain, to avoid a hard border on the island of Ireland. How that was done, the vehicle that is used to achieve that outcome, the preference of the British government was that would be achieved by way of the overall future relationship agreement that was negotiated between the EU and the UK. I mean, if a consequence of that agreement was that we do indeed deliver an open and invisible border on the island of Ireland, well then the Irish government will absolutely be delighted with that outcome. But what we needed to secure was a commitment that in all eventualities, howsoever it is done, we maintain an open and invisible border. There's an absolute commitment to an open and invisible border on the island of Ireland. And if it's kind of achieved through route one, i.e. that wider agreement between the EU and the UK, we'll be one of the first to applaud, because of course that also has benefits for us in terms of the wider trade that there is between Ireland and the UK. 65 billion worth of euros every year in terms of trade in goods and services across the Irish Sea. So we have a lot of interest in terms of securing the very best outcome in terms of the future relationship negotiations.
But the world can see the predicament that the UK government, not just the DUP, is concerned about anything that might treat Northern Ireland separately and possibly lay the path to that becoming even more separate from the rest of the UK. How sensitive is Dublin to that?
I think we understand that. We understand that sensitivity. And we'd be quite alive to it. But I suppose the point that we would make is that Northern Ireland is quite distinct in many ways. It's the subject of an international agreement between two governments. It is even in terms of within the kind of devolutionary settlement in the UK, it is different from Scotland and Wales. There are particular mechanisms there to do with, kind of mandatory power sharing, to do with kind of, north-south arrangements, north-south institutional arrangements, and so forth. So I mean, Northern Ireland is in many respects different in any event. The one thing that the Irish government is very clear about is that, this is completely separate. The issue of how we manage Brexit and how we get the outcomes that we need in relation to Brexit is completely separate to the constitutional question in Northern Ireland. The constitutional question is, the basis for that is the Good Friday Agreement, the principle of consent, and the question that which says that basically the constitutional status of Northern Ireland is governed by the wish of a majority. And it recognises that at the moment the wish of a majority is to remain within the United Kingdom, but if at any stage in the future that should change, well then the British government will be, and to be tested by a border poll, the British government would legislate for such a constitutional change. So, I mean, the constitutional issue, the mechanisms and processes are there. They should be left in the context of the Good Friday Agreement. Brexit is not about that. Brexit and how we manage Brexit is about trying to make sure that we protect the status quo and the gains of the last 20 years.
Okay, it's an honourable try and separate the two things, but the fact is that they're tangled at the moment. I mean, the possible consequence of what the Irish government is arguing now, and the Irish government's insistence on this, is that the talks can't move forward to the second stage. I think it's fair to say few people foresaw the Irish border having this significance at this point, and probably not when those sequencing terms were drawn up back in the summer. But nonetheless, we are where we are, and it has the prominence it does. If we don't move forward to the second stage, there's a risk of no deal. And that's really bad for Ireland as well, isn't it? I mean, how does the Republic, rate those two things? The chance of no deal, talks breaking down, or this issue about the border?
Well, I mean, certainly a no-deal scenario would be a very bad outcome for everybody, and would be a very bad outcome for, I mean, I think for the UK, the European Union, and indeed for Ireland. And in the context of Northern Ireland, I think would be probably the worst of all possible outcomes. So, yes, we're very conscious that it would be a very bad outcome and that we would really wish to avoid.
The carefully non-partisan way of the IFG, I would say I entirely agree with you, but it hangs there as a threat. How do the politics of the EU 27 play into this? This issue has suddenly risen up, and Ireland is feeling very strongly about it. Are the other countries supporting Ireland in this?
Well, I mean, in the immediate aftermath of Brexit back in 2016, in subsequent autumn and over the winter, I mean, the Irish Foreign Minister at the time, who was then Charlie Flanagan, undertook a pretty comprehensive round visit of EU capitals to outline to his colleagues the kind of unique way in which Ireland is impacted by Brexit, particularly in the context of Northern Ireland, the peace process, the Good Friday Agreement. There was an awful lot of solidarity was expressed on that occasion with the situation that we found ourselves in. And a recognition, in fact, that a lot of foreign ministers said to him at the time that the issue, the Good Friday Agreement, the peace process in Northern Ireland, was not just an achievement of. They saw it as not just an achievement of the British and Irish governments and of the political parties in Northern Ireland. They also saw it as an achievement of the European Union, and they took a lot of pride in it, and they had a sense of ownership in it. And I think because the EU itself sees itself as a peace project, I think it sees Northern Ireland as maybe one of the kind of very successful kind of peace projects that it has mentored and so forth. So I think from the very beginning there was a willingness and a readiness to kind of acknowledge the special situation in Northern Ireland and a recognition that it would require unique solutions, and that has been there from the beginning. And I think you've seen that then in terms of the guidelines which the European Council adopted and the Commission's negotiating mandate and so on. All of that recognition of the uniqueness of Northern Ireland, the importance of the Good Friday Agreement, and maintain has been there from the beginning. And I have to say, I think that solidarity has continued and is continuing.
It's interesting describing the EU as a peace project, which some would. We have that picture on our wall for a reason over there. But just sticking with European politics for a moment, how does the German coalition talks play into this? Has it taken away some of the focus on the Brexit talks, aside from the Irish question?
Well, not that is apparent to me from my vantage point. I haven't detected that, I must confess. I know some of my colleagues were recently in Berlin for discussions with their colleagues there. And the message we were getting was a consistent message that we have been receiving from quite some time, and as I said, in terms of Ireland's concern, one of continuing support and solidarity.
And it hasn't resulted in a lack of momentum or something. I mean, everyone was expecting a German coalition to form, and so I guess there's been simply a couple of months of absorption. But suddenly we don't have anything like that certainty. Do you feel any kind of change of direction or loss of focus from the German side?
I think in terms of ongoing business that in terms of the EU, I mean, I don't think we detect any kind of loss of focus. I think the business at hand continues to be managed very effectively by our German partners. I suppose the question of the longer term issues, the future of Europe issues, the question of, kind of in terms of, the vision of President Macron and to what degree, Berlin will get behind that and all of that, and whether we'll see a kind of a renewed kind of Franco-German impetus for reform of the Union, etc. I think probably that won't become apparent until there is a new German government. So I suppose the reform process, to a certain extent, maybe paused while Germany kind of, I suppose, gets a new government. But in terms of the immediate issues that are on the agenda of the European Council and that need to be dealt with, I don't think there's any kind of any kind of distraction and focus in Berlin on those. Would be my sense from here. But as I say, that's only from my vantage point.
Yeah. I mean, Europe has a lot of things on its mind, if I can speak of it as a person. You know, there's Russia, there's immigration, there's the Eurozone. Where does Brexit fit into that?
Well, again, I mean, I think what we've been kind of picking up in terms of engagement with various EU capitals over the last 6-9 months is that while Brexit has been all-consuming in London and indeed all-consuming in Dublin because of the disproportionate impact on Ireland, not just in relation to Northern Ireland, but also in terms of economically and our trade relationship and so forth. Something like 400,000 jobs on both sides of the Irish Sea are dependent on that east-west trade. It isn't necessarily the burning issue in Berlin and Paris and other European capitals. For them, it is some of the issues that you've been talking about, and the longer term question of the future of Europe, and maintaining EU cohesion and unity. These are the absolute, I think, priorities. I mean, now that we're probably at the business end of the negotiation in Brexit, obviously it goes up the agenda in the run-up to the European Council. But I would say that it's not necessarily strategically seen as, I would say, the most pressing challenge, because I think in those countries people accept that the UK has made its decision and it's leaving, and while that's regrettable, I think in a certain sense in a lot of capitals I think they're saying, well, we have to move on now and look to other challenges.
One of our researchers in Brussels at the moment for meetings has described a kind of insouciant irritation, as he put it, with the focus that people are have to spend on Brexit, and they'd rather be thinking about other things. If this UK government remains the government, and if it sticks to its position that the single market is off the table, we're left with either something like a Canadian free trade deal, or possibly, as Britain wants, something in the middle between that and the Norway option. What does that look like from Ireland's point of view?
Well, again, I mean, I don't want to start anticipating, kind of future negotiations. It'd be good to get through phase 1 first, and then we can start worrying about. We could then start worrying about phase 2. And I think in any event, the British government itself has got to make its mind up in terms of exactly what kind of future relationship it aspires to have, and that's probably the first thing. But what I would say in just very general terms is, when we get to phase 2. And the Irish government is keen to get to phase 2 because we have a lot of skin in that game too, as I mentioned. When we get to phase 2, obviously Ireland will still be very much on the EU side of the table. We will be part of the EU 27, will be on that part of the negotiating table. But I mean, we will very much share the vision of the British government, which is to get to the kind of the closest possible economic relationship that we can have between the EU and the UK. Because the closer that relationship is between the EU and the UK, the easier it is to maintain a very close bilateral relationship between Ireland and the UK. And obviously, in the last 20 years, there has been huge improvement in that relationship across all sectors, kind of economically, socially, politically, culturally, and so forth. And that is a huge strategic interest for us, and we want to maintain that. So the closer that the overarching relationship is between the EU and the UK, the closer we can keep the bilateral relationship too.
Are you having talks with UK officials about the possibility of no deal?
No, not really. I mean, in conversations that one has, kind of on the margins of events and so on and things like that. You know, we're having those kind of conversations, I suppose, all the time. And I mean, you know, and where I suppose speculatively people might talk about particular scenarios that might occur, and you know, how appalling the vista would be if that was the scenario, at least from our point of view, you know, etc. Which I think is kind of, you know, pretty widely shared here as well. I mean, I don't think that really is, in terms of policymakers and so forth. I don't know if that's anyone's preference.
What effect does the lack of a government in Stormont have on this?
Well, I mean, I think it is. I think it has been. It certainly hasn't helped matters that for the last year we've had a vacuum in terms of the institutions in Northern Ireland, because it was the case back in 2016 after the referendum, while Sinn Féin and the DUP were on different sides of the argument in terms of the referendum campaign, and are diametrically opposed to each other on the principle of Brexit. After the result, there were some encouraging signs that Sinn Féin and the DUP in government were willing to work together in terms of identifying some common ground that they could work together on, identify some what they both recognised as challenges that would emerge from Brexit, and how they would tackle those challenges, and how they, in cooperation both with the British government and with the Irish government. There was a letter, for example, that I think the then First Minister and Deputy First Minister sent to the Prime Minister back in August, where they identified, August of 2016, where they identified a number of issues where basically that were specific challenges and particular solutions needed to be worked out. In a meeting of the North-South Ministerial Council, which is one of the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement, which took place in November of 2016, both the Irish government and the then Northern Ireland Executive actually agreed a number of common principles, shared principles, that would govern how they would cooperate together in addressing the challenge of Brexit. So, and I think if the institutions had been in place for the year had continued on, we would have been able to continue a dialogue with the Northern Ireland Executive containing all the parties, which would have been maybe helpful in trying to move things forward. And that might have been a better...
Move things forward in what way?
Well, I think that we would have had, in terms of defining what was an acceptable strategy, or a strategy that everyone could sign up to in terms of managing the fallout of Brexit. We could have done that in a way that was kind of you know, that there was an opportunity for kind of a trilateral dialogue with London, Dublin and Belfast that might have, that I think would have assisted us in terms of moving forward collectively, and perhaps avoided what happened yesterday.
You see any outcome for Ireland that is as good as Britain remaining in the EU?
And as good as no, quite frankly. I don't. I mean, you know, two things strike me apart from all the issues that we've been talking about, which are kind of downsides for Ireland. One is that Ireland and the UK have been, in terms of within the EU, have been very like-minded on many policies. For example, in relation to the single market, where Ireland and the UK, I mean, the UK has been the great champion of the single market in the European Union, which is so deeply ironic that we find ourselves where we find now that the single market is something here which people, you know, wish to disentangle themselves from, because of course it was the UK's biggest achievement within the EU. But in any event, Ireland and the UK were very like-minded on the single market and expanding it and all of that, etc. And you know, the EU without the UK is going to be a very different kind of EU, and that will present challenges for us in terms of a very obvious ally, like-minded number of policies will no longer be there.
In terms of shaping the character of the EU going forward.
Yeah, absolutely, and shape and the balance of interests,
as well as the immediate impact on trade and so on.
Yeah, exactly, and that will require us therefore to be be more nimble and agile in developing you know, kind of new alliances and so forth to try and fill that gap. Another consequence will be as well is that, of course, the EU and the fact that the UK was in the EU meant that probably every day in the week in Brussels you had British and Irish ministers and officials meeting each other, formally in meetings on the margins, and that was hugely helpful in terms of developing relationships and developing the bilateral relations, because the funny thing was that Ireland and the UK we became partners in the EU before we became partners in peace in Northern Ireland, and it was a lot of that contact. In the 1970s and the 1980s, firstly in Brussels at that level, informed between ministers and officials, was the beginning of developing a basis of trust between those ministers that we then translated into then working together on the peace process and subsequent Anglo-Irish Agreement, Good Friday Agreement, etc.
And finally, before we go to questions, can you just take us back to the peace process? And 20 years is both a long time and almost nothing in the way of these conflicts and the memory of them. And for those people here, and those not in this room, whom perhaps the conflict isn't so vivid, I wonder if you could just take us into what's been achieved in 20 years, but also what it is that remains so vulnerable about that.
Well, I mean, just for instance, when I joined the Department of Foreign Affairs back in 1983, at the time, none of our colleagues who were working in Anglo-Irish matters, working in Northern Ireland, had any relationships with people in any of the unionist parties, because basically the unionist party would simply not talk to us, and there was no relationship at all. And of course, likewise, we weren't talking to Sinn Féin, because Sinn Féin at the time was closely associated with the IRA, and it was therefore not acceptable for the governments to anyway engage with Sinn Féin. So simply in terms of relationships, if you're trying to chart political progress, find a basis for peace, and you can't even talk to people, well then it's not a particularly conducive context. So I'd say that one of the transformation is that even though now where maybe is a moment of bit of tension and strain perhaps with the DUP, actually we have developed very, very good relationships with the DUP, and in fact in a previous life back in the early noughties, after the DUP became the largest political party in Northern Ireland, and they still weren't talking to the Irish government then at that point, I was involved in some of the very early contacts. In fact, the very first meeting the formal meeting between the DUP and the Irish government took place in the Irish Embassy in London in 2004, and because that was the DUP at the time were more comfortable meeting the then Taoiseach in London rather than Dublin, so the meeting took place. So just I think even just the transformation, the fact that we can have conversations, we can have discussions with all of the parties, that it's a much more inclusive process. That yes, there are moments of tension and some setbacks, but the process nonetheless is robust enough to kind of keep moving forward, and that the relationships are there that at least allow dialogue to continue.
All right, so the achievement on the relationships, but there's still vulnerabilities there, which is why the border is so sensitive an issue.
Yes, there is. The fact is that at a political level, a good deal of progress has been made, but in communities on the ground, relationships can still be quite fragile. I think the job of reconciliation in Northern Ireland was always going to be a matter of generations, not just a few years, and I think one of the dangers, I suppose, at the moment is that the political vacuum in Northern Ireland, the longer the institutions are down, I think the greater the polarisation that you'll have in communities, because I mean, Stormont, when the institutions are working and Stormont is up and running, despite, you know, whatever criticisms people might have about, you know, what it's delivering and all of that, it still represents the focal point for cross-community engagement and dialogue and discussion. Absent Stormont, absent the devolved institutions, I mean, the communities kind of go back into their respective shells, and that's not good for you know, for reconciliation and long-term relationships on the ground.
Thank you for that. Thanks very much indeed. Questions, there are lots, right? Here in the centre. Maddie, thanks.
James Landell, BBC. Ambassador, can you tell me what the phrase regulatory alignment means to you? And how does it differ from membership of the Customs Union and Single Market? And under the deal, did it apply just to Northern Ireland or the whole of the United Kingdom? And secondly, if I may, why did the Irish government believe that the deal would have been acceptable to the DUP?
Well, I mean, I can't. Let me take the second question first. In relation to why do we believe it acceptable to the DUP, I think that wasn't a germane issue for us. I mean, you know, I don't think we were necessarily making any assumptions one way or another about the degree to which, you know, the DUP were, you know, consulted or not consulted or fully on board. I mean, this is a process involving negotiations between Commission Task Force, primarily between the Commission Task Force and the UK, with the Irish government also involved. In terms, because obviously the Commission Task Force need some guidance from the Irish government in relation to what's going to be, you know, acceptable for us in relation to the Ireland and Northern Ireland issues, and so on. So that was the axis for engagement. As I say, you know, it was a matter for the British government, you know, about whom they consulted, and. So, I mean, the Irish government, you know, I don't know that we were necessarily asking any questions along the way, well, you know, about the British government, about who they're consulting. You know, we negotiated in good faith with the British government and the Commission, and the Taoiseach also, you know, accepted yesterday that the Prime Minister was negotiating in good faith as well. So, I mean, I can't really speak for the DUP or the channels of contact with the DUP. And the first question on regulatory alignment. Well, I mean, what I can say about that, James, and I mean, again, I don't want to be drawn on the document. The document hasn't been made public, and until it's been, you know, when it's made public, people can judge it for themselves and judge it in the round. Because I think perhaps what's, you know, missing out a lot of the discussion of the last 24 hours is that, you know, the document was more than two sentences which mentioned regulatory alignment. There were a lot of other important things in the document as well, in terms of providing assurance and reassurance on the Ireland issue, around the common travel area, around there being no diminution in the human rights provisions of the Good Friday Agreement, around the question of citizens' rights in Northern Ireland, the rights of Irish citizens as EU citizens in Northern Ireland. All those things were mentioned as issues that had to be protected and solutions found. But what I will say about regulatory alignment is that one of the things which has been looked at in considerable detail in terms of the discussions in Brussels between the UK government and the task force has been the question of North-South cooperation, and the famous 142 areas of North-South cooperation that were mapped out. What became very clear as one looked at those areas were that so many of them, in terms of the practical areas of cooperation, operated under a broader EU regulatory framework. So that, for example, cooperation in the areas of watercourse management, for instance, on the major watercourses that traverse the border and which involved cooperation between authorities north and south, that they operated under, for example, EU directives, and that provided the regulatory framework in which the two administrations were able to work together in a collaborative way, and so on. Absent that regulatory framework, there was going to be a problem. So it was, as the more we looked at this, the more it became increasingly clear that some mechanisms of regulatory alignment was going to be necessary if we were to continue all that cooperation.
Thank you. Let's go here in the middle. People in the next door room, do feel free to ask questions by the old-fashioned means of walking to the door and waving your hand. Thanks. Here in the middle.
Vernon Bogdanor, King's College London. I want to follow up the first part of James Landale's question. If there were to be some form of regulatory alignment, and it would comprise the whole of the United Kingdom, not just Northern Ireland, would that inhibit the British government in seeking a trade deal with, say, the United States, which might say, well, we'd like you to relax your regulations or alter them in some important way?
Well, Vernon, I think that really is a question for the UK government. I really am not in a position to kind of give you any answer. We're kind of jumping ahead into a lot of phase 2 issues, which number one, I don't think it's appropriate that I'd answer, and number two, I think any answer I would give you would be wildly speculative on my part. But the one point that I would like to come back to again is that in relation to document yesterday, the key element in the document for the Irish government yesterday was an assurance, a very firm assurance, that howsoever it would be achieved, there would not be a hard border on the island of Ireland. And the document did not just see one route to that, i.e. the one that we're all talking about, namely regulatory alignment. There were other possible routes to that as well, and other ones which accorded more closely with the preference of the British government. So the Irish government's position on that is, if we can achieve it, if we can achieve that desired outcome that way, that would be perfectly fine for us. But what we needed a kind of an assurance that if that didn't work out, there would be a stopgap that would, in the context of Northern Ireland, basically guarantee we would not have a hard border on the island of Ireland.
Here.
Yes. Hugo Dixon at InFacts. You said that no deal would be bad for everybody. You also said that you couldn't think of any outcome that would be as good as the whole UK staying in the EU. It seems to me that what happened yesterday is that has put up the chance of no deal, but it's also put up the chance of no Brexit happening. What could or would the Irish government be prepared to do to enhance the chances of no Brexit and reduce the chances of no deal?
You are an ambassador.
Yes, indeed, exactly. Yeah, I think you probably would need the Taoiseach sitting here to answer that question. But look, what I would say, just to come back to kind of the no Brexit scenario, because I noticed kind of like some editorials that had been written here in over the last week or so were kind of accusing the Irish government of wishing to thwart Brexit, and that the stand that we were taking in relation to the hard border was about a wider agenda of actually thwarting Brexit. Now, I don't think we harbour those ambitions. It's certainly not what is driving policy.
Maybe you should.
No. I think at the time, the Irish government during the course of the referendum campaign was very clear in our position, that we articulated a position that we thought that Brexit would be bad for the UK, bad for the EU, and bad for British-Irish relations. And we articulated that view, but we said, but of course we respect the decision of the people of the United Kingdom, and we have respecting, we do respect that decision, and we have to proceed in terms of policy making and so on, in terms of contingency planning and all of that. We have to proceed on the basis that Brexit will happen. But I suppose one thing that is clear is that the form of that Brexit is not clear. That's still up for determination, and if we can use our influence to nudge that in directions which will minimise the collateral damage for Ireland, and particularly minimise the risk to the peace process in Northern Ireland, well then we will exercise our influence as part of the EU 27 to achieve that outcome. But I think we have to, on the basis we have to respect the decision of the UK electorate, and it is only prudent to work on the basis that Brexit is going to happen and to plan accordingly.
Okay, now next to Hugo. Could you wait for the microphone, please?
Katrin Karlweit, Süddeutsche Zeitung, Munich. From your position, what would Mrs. May have to offer to Arlene Foster and the DUP in order to them saying, okay, go ahead, go back to Brussels?
Well, again, I don't know. Is the answer to that? I suppose the only thing is my hope is that, I mean, from my own involvement in kind of negotiations around the Irish peace process over many years, I know that on days, there are sometimes days like yesterday, and when something is about to happen, garbled versions get leaked on the media, people adopt very robust positions, everyone gets very worked up, and sometimes it can be very difficult to kind of de-escalate that within a couple of hours and get people back into kind of deal making mode. And sometimes what's needed is just everyone to step back and to calmly think about it, and maybe to focus on the totality of the package that's on the table. So I mean, our hope is that over the next couple of days that will be possible, that the British government and the DUP will be able to re-engage in this, look at it afresh. As I said, from my understanding of the document, there were a number of things in the document there that actually should give some reassurance to people and were designed to give reassurance to people. For example, around the Constitution, recognising that the constitutional status of Northern Ireland will solely be determined in accordance with the provisions of the Good Friday Agreement, and so on. So I don't know, I can't say to you what it will take, but I'm hoping that some calm reflection and looking holistically at the document as a whole might be helpful in terms of moving things forward.
Thank you. Here in the middle.
John Peet from The Economist. Most of what you've been saying on this topic has been concerning the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, but one implication of what was being talked about yesterday was that there might be regulatory divergence between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, for instance in agricultural products. A consequence of that, one assumes, would be controls in the Irish Sea between Great Britain and Ireland. Shouldn't you be more worried about the possibility of a border in the Irish Sea, given that more of your trade goes across the Irish Sea than north-south? Yeah, well, I mean, the Taoiseach made that clear yesterday, and so did Minister Coveney, is that, the Irish government has never suggested, that there should be a border in the Irish Sea, and as you say, I mean, that wouldn't be, in terms of our wider economic interests, that wouldn't be particularly helpful for us either, in terms of that 65 billion trade in goods and services. I mean, I think overall Irish exports to Britain, I think when we joined the European community, were something like 50%. It's now down to 17% in global terms. But if you look at particular sectors, agri-food, for example, is still hugely dependent on, I think 34% of agri-food exports from Ireland still come to Britain. And I think it might be even something like 40% in terms of beef. And I think
and even higher again in terms of cheddar, for example. So on some sectors will, in terms of access to the British market, remains hugely important. I'm not a customs expert, but I think one of the things I think is that if we reduce this question to, that it is only a binary choice between, border on the island of Ireland or border in the Irish Sea, I think it'll be very difficult to find a way through here. And I think the fact of the matter is that, working the detailed modalities that will deliver the outcome we want, which is no hard border, the detail of that, we'll only get down to the detail of that in phase 2. And that's where we want to be. But we want to be there on the basis of confidence and assurance that there won't be a hard border on the island of Ireland. And I think that's what we need to have. There needs to be confidence and assurance that there won't be a hard border, and then with the flexibility and imagination that everybody profess that they'll bring to this task, I think then we can start looking at the detailed modalities that will deliver the outcome that we want. And I don't think it can be one or other.
Thanks. So loads of hands, more and more going up here on the aisle, and then
Brendan Davies, House of Lords.
Excuse me, could you speak into the microphone? And then in the doorway, I will come to you next.
Member of the House of Lords. I think an awful lot of people in this country will have a lot of sympathy with the Irish government over this. Why ever should the Irish people pay the price of Brexit by having a border across their island? And to answer James Landau's question, why ever should anybody expect the Irish government, which is a sovereign government, to conduct a negotiation with a small political party in another country? So I think that people, when they think about it, will realise that the Irish government have actually been extremely tolerant about a lot of these things. Is it not quite absurd that everybody knows that the best solution to the problem would be for us to remain in the customs area, that all the economic industrial lobbies in this country, CBI, EF and all the rest of them, all of them want us to remain in the common customs area, and that if in fact we did remain in the common customs area, the problem would be resolved. But that the government say that they're tied by the referendum. Of course, their hands aren't tied by the referendum at all. There's no mention of the customs union in the referendum, and I can't actually remember any reference whatever to the customs union in the whole of the campaign.
All right, thank you for that point, and raises the interesting question of what the Lords are going to do about this customs union quickly remaining in.
Yeah, well, look, we've said, again, the government has said kind of pretty clearly over the last few months or so that our preference would be, in terms of that we certainly would it would eliminate obviously the issue in terms of the border on the island of Ireland if the United Kingdom decided to remain within the customs union and indeed the single market. If it just decided to remain within the customs union, that would help. That wouldn't wholly eliminate the problem, because obviously in terms of single market there still have to be regulatory checks and so on, so you don't obviate the need for all checks by just staying in the customs union. You obviate the need for customs, but not necessarily for other regulatory checks that are required, for example in sanitary and phytosanitary. So the Irish government has said that would be our preference if the UK government decided to change his mind and stay in the single market and the customs union. Well, then obviously we'd greatly welcome that. That would obviate our problem. But that it doesn't look like that, and so on. And in those circumstances, then we have to find some other way of delivering the outcome that everybody, British government, Irish government, even DUP, we all share a common objective of avoiding a hard border on the island of Ireland.
Great. In the doorway.
Thank you. Vincent Wood from the Daily Express. Wanted to ask quickly two things. First, how confident is the Irish government that a deal will be brokered before the 14th of December deadline? And secondly, to alert you to some comments from Peter Bone, who said that the papers were leaked to destabilise Theresa May by Irish officials, and I wanted to get your comments on that.
Well, how confident am I? Well, I mean, we believed, I think the government believed that there is certainly, the time is still there and available for agreement to be reached, and that we're hoping that time over the next few days will be used to full effect. I think in reality that probably means the end of this week, because in terms of EU timescales, in terms of the necessary preparations for the European Council bringing forward draft conclusions and all of that, if it goes beyond this weekend, we may run out of time. So we're confident that the time and the opportunity is there to be availed of if people wish to avail of it. But in the first instance, at least, I suppose it's now up to the British government to do whatever necessary consultations it needs to do, and then come back to the European Commission and indicate where it sees there is scope for movement or progress. And obviously the Irish government will respond as positively as we can to whatever news is brought in that regard. In relation to the second question, I don't really want to comment on detail. I just simply, make the point that I think documents, being leaked in Brussels is not exactly an unprecedented development, I think lots of. I think, Bronwen, you were in Brussels for a while, weren't you? And at some stage in your distinguished career,
With what implication?
Yeah, no. But I simply point out, I think that good journalists in Brussels have multiple sources, I think it's very unsafe to be making assumptions about what sources they get their information from. So.
Thank you. Behind it in the black and white top.
Hello. Excuse me. Hello, everyone. My name is Maloney Phelan, and I have been a community responder to Grenfell Tower and have been working in the community ever since. Hello, Ambassador. Hi there. So my question is actually, I think, fairly simple, and it was whilst I was watching 10 o'clock news last night. I thought to myself, as I'm sure everyone else did, surely the British government and the DUP had agreed on the wording of the document before Theresa May went into the meeting. Surely that would have happened, and surely it would have been signed off. And if so, why has that not been released? And if not, why not? Surely that's something that should have been done, and it wouldn't have just been, for example, a gentleman's agreement, as it were. So I'm sorry if that's already been answered, but that's
Thank you very much.
what I think everybody wants to know, really. Thank you.
Thanks, Melanie. I think I have. I don't really have anything more to say to it. Except that, I would say that in negotiations of this type involving governments and particularly of a very sensitive nature like this, I think in all systems there would be a great reticence about, how forthcoming, the key negotiators would be in terms of sharing texts and documents and so forth. But as I say, only the British government can answer that question.
Thanks. All right. On the aisle towards the back.
Yes, Bjarne Nørum, Kristeligt Dagblad, Denmark. I just wonder if you could say some words on Ambassador. How was the level of surprise in Dublin yesterday when you heard that the DUP was managed to pull the emergency brake, and perhaps describe the reaction in less diplomatic words?
The press for a number and
yes.
An exclamation.
Well, I can add the word disappointment to surprise, because I think both were used. Yeah, look, again, I wasn't, I wasn't in the room, obviously, and so forth. But, there was there was an expected choreography, obviously, and people, and in the scheme of these things, people expected the choreography to be rolled out over the course of the day, and all of that. So, I mean, the Irish government had been making its arrangements for that choreography when, you know, word came through that basically no, it's not going to happen today, and etc. So, I mean, the government was under pressure to have to say something. A cabinet meeting had been called that morning and so forth. There was a lot of media interest, therefore, in what was happening. So, you know, the Taoiseach was under pressure to basically come out and explain what had happened. So,
thank you. Here in the front.
A quick question about...
Could you say who you are, please?
Sorry, I'm Jill Rotter from the Institute for Government.
Thank you.
Quick question about the sort of guidelines that we thought we might see yesterday. 'Cause Donald Tusk said he was on the point of releasing the guidelines for phase 2, which means that the 27 have come to some agreement about what they're going to potentially offer the UK on a trading relationship. I just wonder, given that Ireland so clearly would be a massive loser if we ended up with a Canada-style deal, but given that Michel Barnier poses this as a binary choice, you either do Norway or you do Canada, not much in between. I just wondered to what extent the UK might be able to look to Ireland to be advocating more flexibility to do something that allows us to come much nearer to the single market. For example, one of the things that David Cameron didn't get, which made his referendum quite difficult to win, was on freedom of movement. Are the Irish going to be offering the UK government any assistance within the 27 on some further flexibility to allow us to stay close to the single market?
Help us get to the middle ground.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we have to be an important part of, I mean, again, we are on the EU side of the table. I mean, we're on the EU 27 side of the table. That's where we are in this negotiation. We have benefited hugely thus far from support and solidarity of the EU 27 in terms of our key negotiating interests and objectives, and so forth. So, you know, it's incumbent upon us as well to also demonstrate that solidarity as part of the EU 27. But as I said, in overall general terms, it will be, you know, our interests. We will share a fair amount of the same objectives as the UK in terms of trying to achieve, you know, the closest possible economic partnership between the UK and the European Union. So. We will come to the table on the EU side of the table with that perspective, and seek to be as helpful as we can.
We're really, sadly, going to have to draw it to a close then. I'm sorry, there's a cluster of hands up here, and we just couldn't get round them all. Thank you for terrific questions. At least I'm thanking you. Adrian O'Neill may not so much, but Ambassador, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us so openly at such length and giving us the flavour of these negotiations, and to be continued, I hope. But thank you very much indeed.